We really have tried to de-emphasize measurement internally because I worry about people trying to game the metrics. Like I really worry about that company that's like, we're trying to 2x our token spend because there are ways you can do that that return no value to the company, right? So hopefully they're not like no one's bonus is tied to 2xing their token spend. Um,
Welcome, folks. Welcome to Hangar DX podcast. This is a podcast about developer experience and how engineering teams solve productivity challenges at scale. And obviously, we talk about AI. I'm your host, Ankit Jain, co founder of Aviator. At Aviator, we are building AI coding verification platform that helps create guardrails to keep AI under control. Today, my guest is Emily, joining in from Honeycomb. I'm really excited to have this conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about careers. We're going to talk about how AI is changing observability as well. With that, Emily, thank you for joining us. Would love to have you introduce yourself for our audience.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So, as you said, I'm Emily. I'm SVP of Engineering at Honeycomb. Things to know about me: I'm a longtime Honeycomb employee at this point. I am a startup person and was, used to doing that, move to a new startup every 2 or 3 years thing, but really kind of found my home at Honeycomb and have been here for the last about 8 years now. Before that, I love the developer tool space, so I'd been at a string of developer tools companies that I'm very proud of, Bugsnag and GitHub before Honeycomb. And a little bit interesting for me, I come from primarily a front-end engineering background, which I think is a little more rare for my role. Honestly, that was what really got me excited about the observability and monitoring space. As a front-end engineer, you're so close to customers and you want to answer questions about them. And that was just what pulled me into wanting to build better observability and monitoring tools. So here I am.
That's amazing. I definitely want to double click on that to get started. Coming from front end engineering and now sort of SVP of Honeycomb, so that's quite a big long way to go. You've also been at company for 8 years, which is almost never heard of in Silicon Valley for sure. So tell us a little bit about your journey, kind of how did you grow in the ranks and kind of got to this role, and if you have sort of like even advice for folks who are looking to sort of grow into leadership roles.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, I was sort of a longtime startup person, and the thing I love about startups is so often if you can do more, if you think you can have more impact, people will let you do that, and that was certainly what I found at Honeycomb. So I joined back in 2017. I was coming from a job at a company I was very happy at. I was managing a couple of teams, but I met, Charity and Christine, Honeycomb's founders, and I just thought, oh gosh, they're working on the product I always wanted as an engineer, and they have just this great team that are so smart and humble, and I know I would learn from them every day. So I started talking to them about a role, and I said, hey, I'm managing teams. I would love to do that for you. And Charity sort of said, hey, we're a 10 or 11 person startup at this point. We don't really need that. But she said, we really don't have any dedicated front end engineers. If you want to, step into that sort of role, we'd love to have you. And then I promise, if there's management to be done down the road, we'll think about you for it. And she said to me, it probably won't happen for a long time, which is like, as soon as you say something like that, it's over, right? And it turned out that just a couple months down the road, Charity realized that, her expertise was really in managing more back end and sort of operational focused teams. And she realized as we were, getting deeper into the product development that managing there was a little bit different. And so she basically said, hey, why don't you start managing this part of the engineering team? I'll keep this part. She was Honeycomb's CEO at the time, so she was managing most of the company. And I think we found that we had really compatible styles. And so sort of just we're like load balancing the engineering leadership at the company ever since. But what really worked for me at Honeycomb and let me sort of kind of step up into management and take on those different pieces was I really saw a place that I could help. I said, I've got skills that could be useful here. I was willing to go out on a limb and just say like, hey, give me a shot. And then I think kind of special to Honeycomb, um, the company has founders who are willing to sort of take a chance and be like, I'm going to let you try to do something you haven't done before because you've like sort of earned my trust up to this point. Not every set of founders are willing to do that. And so I do think like if you're thinking about career progression and you're trying to pick the next startup you work at, looking at companies that have had a track record of giving people a chance to do something new can be a really good indicator.
Wow, that's quite a story. So, a few things that I'm learning. One is obviously being at a company for a long time, being able to build that trust, right? I think kind of like that also takes a while. It's not that, three is like obviously having the right founding team who's like willing to actually bet into and invest into existing people. Do you have any sort of like advice for like obviously like folks who are working in maybe large organizations? Like you joined Honeycomb when there were 10, 11 people, so like been a while. But like what do you look for when you're sort of like, obviously helping people grow in their careers, and maybe kind of like if you were to give advice to folks who are looking to grow into their leadership roles?
That's a great question. Honestly, I think the most important thing that some engineering leaders miss is that you really have to have a perspective on not just what is good engineering in your part of the company, but what makes that part of the business really successful. And you
Hmm.
need to show the people above you that that's what you're thinking about all the time. Not, how do we keep the product up? How do we ship a great quality experience to customers? Those things are important, but like, do you track the most important business metrics for that part of the company? And do
Hmm.
you have a story for how improving your part of engineering makes those metrics move. Like the people who can sort of connect those dots, I think are the ones that are most often given that chance to kind of step up to the next level.
Very cool. Amazing. So, switching gears a little bit, I would want to talk about all the chaos that is happening in, like, culturally in engineering in the last 2 years, right? Like, everyone is freaking out, people are losing jobs. And then we're talking about possibly shake up in management, where it's like, oh, maybe you don't need that many layers, maybe you don't need that many managers in the organization. What is your kind of like, opinions on this? Kind of like, how do you think about some of those roles evolving over time?
This is a really interesting moment where we're seeing the same thing happen to the management and IC ladders, maybe for different reasons, but in both, it's like we're really losing a lot of roles at the lowest end of the ladder. And I'll be really interested to see what the impact of that is over the long term. I think, on the IC side, I feel like that's a little bit better understood. I think there's a lot of conversation about that. We don't know exactly what's going to happen yet, but I think we understand that a lot of companies are maybe hiring fewer people overall, and so that means these roles at the lower end are contracting. For managers, I actually think the reasoning is a little bit different, and that has been much more about this kind of push for efficiency, like especially coming out of the ZERP era. All of a sudden efficiency is so much more important to engineering teams, and people are seeing places where they can squeeze the
Mm,
manager to IC ratio to just be more efficient overall. I To me, it really feels like a short-term optimization. If we think that we have our managers have capacity to pick up more, in this moment, I would actually so much rather see them be a little more embedded in the team's technical work and do more to move engineering work forward, just because I think the space is changing so fast that managers really benefit from getting as much hands-on experience as possible. I can understand why companies are wanting to do these much flatter org charts and have, 20 engineers report into one manager, but I'm also old enough that I remember, the early 2010s when we did that and it didn't go well. It just means that you stop hearing about concerns from a lot of your employees until it's too late to address them. I think we're kind of in this moment where the pendulum has swung, where companies are not as concerned about retention. But at the end of the day, companies want to keep their top people no matter what. And I really worry that these companies are doing something that makes sense as a short term optimization that's going to bite them down the road.
right. I mean, this is actually true. Like, I've definitely heard it from a few other folks that there's a lot of expectations from many organizations that their managers are also hands on, in the sense that they're actually spending some of their time writing code, or at least understanding what's going on in the organization by being very, or like deep into the product discussions and the technical discussions. How do you feel about that?
Well, so I'll say I think companies, like, if you're going to make a change, I do think you have to pick one. Like you can all of a sudden have 20 people reporting into one manager, or you can ask them to get more technical. Asking them to do both just, I think, it's like nonsensical. There's only so many hours in the week. I do, in general, I think it is a good moment to be asking managers to get a little deeper into the technical work. And I say that knowing that that's controversial, that not every engineering leader supports that, but as engineering managers, so much of our taste and judgment is really formed from the work that we did as ICs. And if the way that we build software is changing, a lot of people are just not going to understand that as well secondhand as they are if they really kind of go get their hands in the work. I think the rule that's still important that I would encourage managers to have, though, is that um, you're not picking up the work that's in the critical path. I think managers are leading the team, but as ICs, I think it actually goes better when they do work that is supporting rather than like the most essential pieces. Because otherwise, you've got two things that are most important, and which one do you prioritize? You never know.
Interesting. That's very interesting. So, kind of like maybe just even taking a reflection on your work. Do you see like within the last year or so that your work or responsibilities or like even how you spend your time has shifted?
Ooh, that's a good question. Certainly, I feel that pull to be a little more directly hands-on in the code and in the data, but I also see that that's getting much easier, with so many products launching, an MCP and, things like code just like making it easier to kind of like plug all your stuff together and have your own environment. I feel that pull to understand the stuff firsthand, but I also feel like it's easier than, when you had to go like set up the development environment for your company 5 years ago, and as a VP, that might be like really embarrassing and difficult. And you like, you might not have all the right access, you might not be able to figure out how the pieces plug together. At least there is more support to get more hands-on.
Cool. So I know obviously, Honeycomb is known for some of the technical architectures or better engineering practices. I think a lot of this also goes to like charity measures tends to be a very, let's just say, vocal person, right? In some ways, she's been on social, I think, since the beginning of Honeycomb, or maybe even before that. And I think a lot of her thoughts are amazing. Like some of them are like counterintuitive. I learned quite a lot from sort of like we did a podcast with her a few months ago. How is it like working with Charity and Christine, right? Christine, on day-to-day basis, kind of like do you see some of those cultural aspects also reflecting into sort of like the culture of the company?
Ooh. I do, although I would say one really nice thing about Charity and Christine as a founding team is that they tend to kind of be opposite sides of the spectrum no matter what we're talking about. Charity, I think, is much more like burn it all down, kind of iconoclast, and then Christine is much more a little more balanced, can see both sides. Charity also comes from kind of more of an ops background or infrastructure background, and then Christine is much more sort of core SWE, like product developer, writing code all day. And so it's particularly nice for me because I generally feel like I don't have to be on the far end of the debate on either side because they've already got, the kind of two ends covered. And then I think what it leads to is a really good culture of kind of robust debate internally, right? Like Charity has strong opinions, but that doesn't mean that we all have to just sort of go along with her opinions. It means that we get to have like good first principles conversations within the company and decide what Honeycomb believes. I think this is one thing we actually haven't represented that well externally. Like sometimes what Charity believes is not exactly the same as what Honeycomb believes, but we will have a good conversation to figure out what the daylight is between those two things.
Switching gears a little bit, I mean, still on the career, maybe it's at least worth double clicking on this, which is with AI, you already shared how sort of your role is evolving. Do you also encourage sort of like maybe your teams, or do you expect sort of like, as uh, ICs turn into like management roles and like other kind of like career progressions? How are these people upskilling themselves? How are you kind of like actually giving them suggestions in terms of what to prioritize, how to spend their time, how to think about the expectations?
Yeah. So we did do a top-down founder memo. I think kind of late last summer, Charity and Christine sent a letter to the company saying, and our internal target was 2x. So they said, we really believe in this new technology. We really want people to spend time experimenting and learning about it. And we believe that, it's sort of a kind of line in the sand goal that everyone should have is that we should all try to 2x our impact with AI over the next year. So I like it. I think it was you've heard some maybe more outlandish mandates, and I think that one is both is aspirational and achievable at the same time. Mostly in the early days of that, we just sort of set employees free with all the tools and said, "Hey, go experiment, go figure it out." I think we've gotten, by maybe the 6-month mark, I think we got most of the upside we were going to get from that approach. And at a certain point, it becomes clearer that you need to sort of have systems, processes, a really clear internal AI platform that, you're sort of driving people toward. And so that's the phase that we've sort of moved into now where it's no longer just here's the buffet of every possible tool under the sun, and here's a company credit card that you can go, charge a bunch of tokens to. But we're going to start, we're starting to do more of telling, like we've really standardized on Claude code, but there's also just other places where we're sort of saying, hey, we think these are the right tools and you should work with them this way. As far as upskilling, I don't actually feel that we have a perfect answer to that yet today. They ask a lot of engineering leaders this, like, how do you upskill your team on AI? Are there courses you recommend? Are there things that you recommend that they do? Are there trainings? And it still feels like it's all over the map. I don't know that I've heard the same answer twice. The thing we are starting to see a need for that we're working on now is putting together a little more of a company perspective on where we think the landscape is going. There still is such a range of possible outcomes that people are preparing for. Obviously, the most outlandish ones are like, we're going to be at AGI in 2 years and we're all going to get universal basic income and live on an island. And then there's like the pessimist view of, this is all hype and it's going to go away. And so we have tried to be a little more directed about, hey, this is kind of where we see the landscape going. This is how we think software engineers are going to work. This is what it means for us. Um, and trying to start sort of distilling some of that down on a regular basis, because there just is such a range in terms of how much people have the appetite to go read every tweet and blog post versus, realistically, I'm going to look at a couple things a week, but I still need to stay up on the space.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
do you hear answers that you like to that question? Like, what do you hear companies doing that you think is really good?
Honestly, like it's all over the spectrum. There has been at least one company I have heard that they've just set the goal that their spend on AI should exceed their payroll of engineers by end of the year. And I was like,
Wow.
that is wild. I would be very surprised that it is achievable, just because I mean, especially salaries in Silicon Valley, they are pretty high, and being able to spend that kind of money just on tokens sounds insane. But you never know, right? I think I almost feel like every 3 months we have to reset some of our expectations, and even I'm sure like some of the memo stuff that you have sent out to the team, you may have to reevaluate every 3 to 6 months is like how things are changing. And I think from our community, a lot of things that we hear are obviously everyone is experimenting, everyone is trying to figure out how to get the best value, but almost everyone also agrees that they call them token sellers are like definitely hyping up the value of software, kind of like how much AI is doing or like making a difference versus the reality. In the sense is like, the software engineering is solved. I think we are still just at the first phase of really understanding how to work with the new frameworks. And there is a lot more to be built rather than expecting that, all the problems are already solved.
Yeah, I like that. That makes a lot of sense.
So, I mean, back to you. So, I mean, I think you're already covering a little bit of it. Maybe I would want you to cover both sides of this, which is okay, you're sharing a bit about how you're changing internally, about like how developers operate and use AI. There's also this other aspect, which is like, how do you actually think about AI strategy for Honeycomb itself? It's definitely interesting to talk to organizations that have been on the growth phase and then the AI wave happened in the middle of it, right? Which means is like now many organizations are rebuilding their plans on what does it mean, what does go to market mean, what users are we trying to target, like how does our product evolve. So kind of like would love to hear both sides of those coins. Like I think you already covered a little bit on the internal side. Anything else you want to share? And then on the product side.
To your point, we are in an interesting position where we do have a lot of existing customers and they are just sort of all over the curve in terms of like AI maturity. We talked to a bigger company that was kind of more maybe like financial sector, and they were like, we just got authorization this week to turn on ChatGPT, right? So like there's still people that are at that point. And then we do have some customers. I think like Intercom would be a good example, with Finn, or Duolingo has been doing a lot with AI. There are customers who really got on that wave early and really have these incredible success stories. And it is an interesting challenge to try to build product for both of those at once. Like, it does feel like there are people who just, they know what an observability experience means to them, and it is classic Honeycomb. And, we really have quite a strong commitment to letting people work with their observability data in the way that is familiar to them, that they know how. And there are plenty of people coming to us now going, I won't buy a tool that isn't, AI enabled, because that's the future, right? Like, to get any of my engineering budget, you have to show me how this is an AI observability tool. And it is really interesting to try and balance between those two.
Interesting. So, do you have a set group within the organization who's focused on building AI capabilities, or is it sort of like, do you have like sort of like a platform team which is building infrastructure for AI, and then there's product teams building on top of it? Just maybe share a little bit about how your org structure looks like and has it changed because of AI?
Yeah, that's already something we've evolved over the last year. So originally, we just sort of had a kind of small and fast moving product development team. And these were, we sort of tapped the people within the organization who just sort of naturally were most excited about these technology. It was the people who were using ChatGPT in like 2023 and, really had been following the whole wave. we mostly just sort of tried to like put them off in a corner so that they could kind of experiment and move quickly on their own. As it's become clearer that this is sort of a foundation of our, product strategy for the next couple of years, it has become much more everyone is involved in some way. And so that definitely necessitates a different structure. And we are starting to build out. We actually have two different parts of the company that I would consider to have like kind of an AI platform responsibility. So our data engineering team understands that, what they are building needs to become the kind of intelligence layer for the whole company, the way that we can have sales and marketing and engineering and product all looking at the same data. And then within engineering, just within the last quarter, we have spun up a team specifically focused on AI platform for engineering tools. And that team is still kind of like, finalizing its roadmap, but I think it's a lot of, um, again, centralizing on a small set of tools and then making everything work together really, really well. Um, and then on top of that, the product development teams are now, it's a real spectrum from basically we're building features the way we would have 2 years ago to, we're building wildly experimental stuff with AI to we are taking core product experiences and AI enhancing them to make them more, useful and easier to get value out of.
Interesting. How do you measure the ROI on these things? Like, is there sort of like, I mean, again, giving the example that I just gave earlier, right, which is our company thinking about like, okay, we're going to just spend tokens equal to the payroll of the company's engineers, versus these are like significant costs which adds up, especially if you're building AI within your product versus like using AI internally to accelerate some of the software development. How do you, as an organization, think about the strategic bets you're making? Are there like places where you're saying no, this is like maybe not worth investing in right now?
The first thing I want to acknowledge is that there's a lot of fear when you ask, like, how do you measure AI impact and AI productivity? Like, I think so many, not just engineers, but like so many people across software companies are worried about what does this mean for my job? And so, as soon as we did the kind of 2x mandate from Charity and Christine, whenever we sort of roll out a new technology, the first question we always get from engineers is like, how are we going to measure this? How do you know if we're doing enough? We really have tried to de-emphasize measurement internally because I worry about people trying to game the metrics. Like I really worry about that company that's like, we're trying to 2x our token spend because there are ways you can do that that return no value to the company, right? So hopefully they're not like no one's bonus is tied to 2xing their token spend. But for us, there's just a lot of different indicators that I look at that try to get signal. Like part of it was going into headcount planning. Is the shape of team we're trying to make different? Like, we're not one of those teams that is specifically trying to adopt AI to reduce the size of the company. Like, I think we would much rather see our employees be higher impact rather than try to, fire people because of AI. But does it mean that we get to shape our teams differently? Does it mean that we are moving people over to, roles or areas of work that we think are higher impact? We've seen a little bit of that, but not a ton yet. I would also say we actually get a lot of value out of self-reporting. And I think this takes trust between, you have to have a relatively high trust organization. But like if I ask engineers on my team, hey, do you think you're at 2x or not? What people give back in terms of self-reporting actually aligns pretty well with what I've seen. And we do have, we've got a handful of people who think that they're well beyond 2x. And I'm like, I can see that from your work. Like even if I hadn't asked you, that's the answer I would have jumped to. So I think there is a little bit of like when it's working, you can see it. And these measurement questions kind of go away a little bit. The thing I would like to try is I actually would like to have every engineer like self-report once a month or once a quarter, and then have the manager do like a self-report for the team and just be like, relative to this yardstick, yeah, like how much have you increased your impact with AI? And I would guess that that would be one of the most accurate or most valuable measurements we'd have, because so often like the things that prevent engineers from upskilling are structural, right? This team has been working toward a big deadline for the last 6 months, right? People don't have any slack time, or the area of the code base they're working on is just so optimized and in a language that there's not very good tooling for or something like that. So often
Hmm.
it's like we can help if we know.
Interesting. I mean, and also, yes, like many of the AI tools have a really high, satisfaction score, in the sense is like everyone feels very productive, even though the outcomes don't always reflect the same productive impact. Suspect, I mean, like not suspect. This is something we also talk about a lot in the community, which is coding is only a part of software engineering. There's a lot of other things around like reviews, decision making, testing, and kind of like strategizing, judgments. All of those things still require time, and many of those things still are working at the same pace that they were working on before.
Yes, that is such a good point, and I really feel like as a community, we've almost, we've sort of done ourselves a disservice by being so focused on AI code generation. I have almost wanted to run an experiment where we just say like, wherever you are in the adoption curve, wherever you're trying to get to, don't focus at all about getting better at generating code with AI. Focus on every other part of your workflow, or doing something where like each sprint or something, we try to optimize a different part of how we work. Because I actually I feel like the gains in many of those areas could actually be better than for us. We're not a greenfield app, right? It's a lot of like existing code. There's a lot of context you have to absorb to be able to write code well, and so that's the kind of environment where I can imagine getting a higher lift off of documentation, off of code review, off of anomaly detection, some of those other areas.
Right, right. I mean, we've also like changed a little bit of our workflow. For instance, we now don't rush into like writing code. We spend a lot of time actually initially doing planning and kind of like deciding things, and spend time kind of like even writing specifications and like plans. And once we agree on those things, like going from there to actually shipping the product feature, that time is much smaller, right? So kind of like we essentially preload most of our time, and we've definitely noticed a big difference in terms of how we actually operate.
Ooh, I love that. Do you do anything to try to capture prompts that go into your
I mean, now that you're asking,
product
like we
development?
actually are have a product itself that we have dog food. It's called Runbooks, which actually gives you an ability to share prompts with your team. So we actually use that heavily ourselves, where we actually do planning and then we share this. We're actually also working a review workflow where you can actually review the prompts and the specs before you implement. I think this is definitely something which has changed a lot of our SDLC, or like at least like the time where we would spend on SDLC. We are also working on things around verification, but that's one part where testing and validating the changes you're making is still a lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's some interesting approaches to that on the horizon, but I definitely feel like we're in the era of people are just sort of trying everything to see what works to make that problem better. Like I've seen a couple blog posts recently about, people trying to use synthetic monitoring in lieu of tests, just like cover their entire app with, different sort of synthetic monitoring touch points to feel more confident. And it feels almost like it's a little bit of going back to, like the 2010s era. Like, we're reviving some of those dreams, but maybe they work differently this
Yeah,
time around.
absolutely. I mean, like TGD, BDD, all of those concepts, right, which were popular like in the early 2000s, is sort of like feel like they're coming back.
Yeah, like I come from the Ruby community at one point, and Cucumber was a tool that I always hated because it was about like writing out in natural language what your app was supposed to do, and then behind the scenes you were turning it into code. And I'm like, that's like a tool that finally makes sense in this era because
Absolutely.
like what you want is a clear text description of what a product feature is supposed to do.
Yeah, I've also heard like Gherkin is also like something people have started using now more, which is amazing. Yeah. Okay, kind of like going back to the topic. So I know we're coming close to time. So maybe I think one thing which I would love your opinion on, and I'm sure your opinion will matter a lot more here, is just kind of like where is observability going? I think I'm also would want to understand what's your take on these AI SRE tools kind of which are like popping up. How do you kind of like see the role of DevOps, SRE, and observability evolving maybe in a couple of years?
That's a good question. I've got to say, observability feels more essential than ever, and I'm not just saying that as someone who works at an observability company, but like, I think people in the observability community understood for a long time that it was kind of a myth that you'd ship code into production and its behavior would be deterministic until you did another release, right? Like we have not been living in that world for a long time, but a lot of teams sort of fooled themselves into believing like it passed the unit test. Now I know exactly what it's doing in production. A really nice thing for us observability people is that everyone has now acknowledged that they don't think that's true. Your release could be out there doing you don't know what in production, and you've got to have ways to find out quickly. So I think observability more important than ever. But the way that people are working with observability tools, I think, is really starting to change. And what I see is an expectation of fewer chores. Like I'm always one of those people who is like the little scout on the team, who's going to follow all the rules and like make sure I like, like check the observability after each release. And so many people never actually wanted to do all that stuff. They didn't want to go like tag their columns in the tool. They didn't want to go check the graphs after each release. They didn't look at the dashboard every morning. And I love that we're now moving into this world where so many of those things that just sort of required our team to be good, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Scouts, we can have computers do that stuff now so that people don't have to. But at the end of the day, when a human needs to go get to the answer to, hey, what is happening in production, observability is still the tool that's going to unlock that. So I think like I think actually it's an incredible time to be an observability company because uh, we can make the experience so much better for people. As far as AI SRE, I am optimistic about that tool category with a caveat. I think those tools, just like our actual SREs, benefit from tons of context and experience. And the ones that are trying to build an AI SRE experience without deep access to all of this different, mostly observability data about your systems, I think they often demo really well. But do they actually find novel issues in production before your engineers? I worry that they don't. We're starting to kind of dabble in this product area, and I'm actually really excited about it because I'm like, yeah, we have the depth of data you need to build a really great AI SRE experience. And I think, like, again, I think Honeycomb leans toward we want a human in the loop. We just want to make their job as fast and pleasant as possible. So I see an AI SRE as surfacing, making it a great experience to respond to a production incident, right? If you have to be up at 2 in the morning or whatever, as soon as you get up, it's this is what's going on. This is what we think happened and why. This is the code change that we think would fix it. And then you as the human get to validate that instead of having to,
Prove it,
put your
right?
glasses
Yeah.
on and figure out what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, I also think like actually human in the loop is still important. Part of the reason that you're mentioning, like even some of the debugging that I've done myself, I've noticed that many of the AI tools are trained to complete the task at hand as quickly as possible, which means is many times, like even when I'm debugging, it will find the first issue and try to fix it. And many times that issue is just a band-aid fix versus understanding the root cause. Last week I was like talking to some of my friends. I was like joking that I spent 5 hours schooling Claude Code because it would not get into the actual root cause and try to kind of like fix on the surface layer issues.
Yes, and to this, it's like it's all those mentorship skills that we built working with junior engineers. Like they're really relevant, but I wish it were a little more rewarding to spend all that time training Claude Code.
So, Emily, thank you so much for your time. This was a blast. Learned so much about the history of Honeycomb and your role. And thank you all for listening. If you're interested in developer experience or work in DevOps, platform teams, join us. We also host these sessions as on virtual Zoom sessions. Join us on dx.community. Emily, again, thank you so much for your time. Awesome.